So it's not that South Korea has an especially fragile democracy, it's that democracy is an especially fragile system at a particularly fragile moment in history. And South Korea, unlike a lot of other places, really has passed the stress test with flying colors so far.
I think we thought after 40 years we really had a strong democracy, and how something like this could really happen was a really shock. What was your first thought when you heard about this martial law declaration from our president?
Well, my first reaction, like yours, was one of shock. But as a political scientist, my reaction was this will be over in a matter of hours. There's no way that he's going to be able to pull this off. Because, again, I think because I knew perfectly well how South Korea's people were going to respond. I knew that the military has really stepped back from politics in South Korea to a much greater extent than in other parts of Asia. And so it seemed to me this was a really just a foolish maneuver that was bound to fail. So although it was concerning, I had a lot of confidence that the Korean people and Korean institutions would hold, and that's a sign of Korea's democratic strength. What I would say is I wouldn't take this event as saying anything negative or frightening about Korea. It says something negative and frightening about democracy and about democracy's stability in general. The point is that democracy is, although the people have to fight for it, and in South Korea, South Korea is only a democracy because the people did fight for it. Democracy also requires, elite behavior. Elites have to buy into the system. They have to choose to play within the rules. They have to choose to be the servants of the people. In a democracy, the politicians work for us. We don't work for the politicians. And the politicians have to accept that. And when they don't accept that, things can go very, very bad very quickly. So South Korea is no different from anywhere in the sense that it really just takes, one leader trying to aggrandize power, frustrated with gridlock, who thinks, that they're the true leader of the people and they're being blocked by undemocratic forces. Democracy is always just one power grab away. So it's very fragile. It's always fragile. Especially in an era when democracies are struggling so much everywhere. I mean, the tide of history right now is not in democracy's favor. So it's a great moment for someone like President Yoon to say, well, why not? Thailand, Myanmar, people declare these things all the time and they get away with it. So it's not that South Korea has an especially fragile democracy, it's that democracy is an especially fragile system at a particularly fragile moment in history. And South Korea, unlike a lot of other places, really has passed the stress test with flying colors so far.
You're mentioning the democracy is a fragile system at a fragile time. Why do you think it's more fragile now than before? That we're seeing democracy fading all over the world. Why do you think that's happening?
That's a very big question and a hard one. I think that the main explanation I would offer is that there are kind of forces, particularly on the political right, who have kind of lost their confidence in democracy, and gained confidence that they can impose their view, their cultural views, their nationalist views over more vulnerable minorities and people who have a more cosmopolitan take on politics. So during the Cold War, people on the political right supported authoritarianism largely because they were opposed to communism. And then when communism went away, the political right became much weaker or much more moderate because they didn't have to fight communism anymore. That's South Korea's story very much. It was, by the time you got to perestroika and glasnost in the Soviet Union, by the late 1980s, there was no real credible threat of communism within South Korea. And that made it easier for the people on the right to say, well, we can accept democracy. It's not going to lead us in this, anti-capitalist direction. But now I think what we see on the political right is sort of that anti-cosmopolitanism has replaced anti-communism. And what we see is that opposition to things like women's rights, to the rights of immigrants, things like the rights of LGBTQ citizens, opposition to abortion rights in the United States, these kinds of these sort of cultural grievances, if you will, have led to a lot more support for authoritarian measures at times, and a desire to sort of recapture the institutions of the state and have them do the bidding of more traditionalist, nationalist, anti-minority kinds of forces. And I think that they have kind of a champion in Vladimir Putin, who I think has sort of shown how this works and has given kind of either active support for or has certainly served as inspiration for a lot of leaders around the world who also think, well, I could also clamp down on behalf of my chosen people against the internal minorities and enemies who oppose me, and I'll get away with it. And increasingly that's true. So that's not the only story going on, but I think it's probably the most important one and shows why it's not just in one place, but there's this sort of general virus of autocratization that really is spreading around the world right now.
Especially the young generation, the people in their 20s and their 30s who were on the street with the K-pop glowing sticks, really showed what they can do. So I think that in some ways, if this generation could be more participated in politics, that we will really have more diverse, different change and transition in our politics sphere. How should we make the young generation more interested in politics, do you think?
Well, I think that when it comes to youth in politics, the last decade or so has sent a lot of worrisome signs as well as positive signs. So I think there's usually a view that with each generation, people get more politically progressive. They become more open to, the rights of new groups, to gender equality, to equality in sexual orientation, all these kinds of things. And what we're seeing is that in a lot of places, young voters are actually turning quite conservative. Again, not in a way that just sort of says trying to, maintain the system, but conservative in the sense of more of a hard right sense, trying to undermine the system, trying to undo the democratic gains, trying to undo the rights that have been gained in recent decades. And so the youth of the world right now are a battleground. We cannot assume at all that young people, first of all, that they'll be involved in politics, or they're going to hold any kind of sort of democratic or progressive commitments. And so we really need to be thinking about our education systems. We need to be thinking about how we use public resources like the media, public events, to sort of show the lessons of history, and show how hard it was to secure democracy and what did things look like in South Korea when it was ruled by a dictatorship. Young people need to know this. So teaching the lessons of history, not that there's one truth in history, but just teaching about how things have been in the past will hopefully, get people interested, and hopefully people's sense of civic duty will make them want to be involved in politics in a way that upholds their democratic life. Because if you're not doing it, then those politicians you don't trust, they get to do it by themselves. And there's no world in which that's better.
Is there any message to Korean citizens and our viewers who went through all this last few weeks?
Well, my main message is thank you. The world is watching. The world is incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. We're in many ways envious of the ways you've been able to come together to defend democracy. So all those long nights and cold nights and lack of sleep have not gone unnoticed by the world. And the broader point I would make is that we tend to think about the world in, well, there's young democracies and there's emerging democracies and developing democracies like South Korea, and then there's established democracies or consolidated democracies or mature democracies like the United States, or there's Western democracy, and then Western democracy doesn't necessarily spread to the East. We have to get rid of all of these notions. These notions are totally wrong-headed. And I think what we see now is that there are no adults in the room. Right? There's no, there's no democratic capital of the world. There's no democratic shining light or anything of the sort. South Korea is showing what it means to establish democracy, to prove democracy's strength in a way that is the envy of people like me in the United States who would love to see a similar kind of fight and pushback and accountability for insurrectionary behavior by its elected leaders, as South Korea has shown. So thank you. And I think, again, South Korea should stand very, very tall. Koreans should be staying very, very tall right now and saying that, they've managed to accomplish something that is really kind of the pinnacle of what it takes to defend a democracy. And anyone who thinks South Korea is still just a developing democracy or a young democracy or is somehow lesser than these older ones, no. The youth is one thing, but the youth has grown, and the youth is showing a strength that the older democracies in the world could learn a lot from.
Thank you so much.
Keep up the good. Keep up the good fight. Be strong. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.